My name is Diane Marlowe. I'm 54 years old, and I founded a forensic accounting and wealth advisory firm that now manages $180 million in client assets. My only brother skipped my open heart surgery for his son's soccer game, and by the time he found out why that mattered, I'd already closed on his $612,000 sale he never saw coming. 6 days after a surgeon cracked my sternum open to repair a failing heart valve, my brother stood in my living room, red-faced, asking how I could do this to family. He had no idea I'd been giving him 13 years of warnings. He simply chose not to read. You've always cared more about numbers than people, Diane. My mother told me once, a long time ago, in a kitchen that doesn't belong to either of us anymore. If you're watching this, go ahead and hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every one. But to understand why that phone call finally broke 13 years of careful, polite silence, let me take you back to October of 2011, to a hospital hallway in Belmont, Ohio, 3 days after my father died. I was 39. My father, Harold Marlowe, left the family house on Cedar Hollow Road to my brother Gregory and me jointly, 50-50, tenants in common, appraised at the time at $240,000. Gregory was 42, married to Renee, and they just had my nephew Tyler. Gregory had always been the favored one, the one my parents bragged about at church, the one whose sales job at a regional insurance company got described as practically running the place, while my forensic accounting career got a polite nod and a change of subject. 2 months after the funeral, my mother, Joan, sat me down at that same kitchen table and asked me to sign my half of the house over to Gregory for $1, so his young family could settle in properly without the complication of owing me anything. I said no, not because I didn't love them. I said I'd let Renee and Gregory live there while they got on their feet, but I wanted either fair market rent or a buyout at appraised value within a reasonable window, because that house was half mine and I had a business to build. My mother's face went cold in a way I'd never seen. You've always cared more about numbers than people, Diane, she said. Maybe that's why you don't have a family of your own to worry about. Gregory didn't defend me. He just stared at his coffee. I didn't cry at that table, and I didn't cry in my car afterward either. I remember feeling unnervingly clear-headed, like something that had been blurry my whole life had suddenly come into focus. I drove back to my apartment in Columbus that night, and I opened a fresh accordion folder, wrote Cedar Hollow on the tab in permanent marker, and started keeping everything. The will, the appraisal, every text where Gregory promised to figure out the buyout soon. I didn't know yet that folder would sit in a fireproof lockbox for 13 years. That's where Helen Ostrowski came in. Helen was 61, a senior partner at the firm where I was a junior forensic accountant making $52,000 a year, and she was the first person in my adult life who told me my boundaries were reasonable instead of cold. She mentored me through 2 brutal fraud litigation cases, vouched for me for a promotion my own manager tried to block, and in 2016, when I told her I wanted to start my own practice, she said, "Then let's start it together," and became my business partner. Helen became the family I chose. She never once made me explain why I didn't attend Thanksgiving at Cedar Hollow. Year 1 at Marlowe and Associates, we billed $310,000. Year 3, we crossed $2.1 million, mostly forensic litigation support for law firms untangling embezzlement cases. Year 7, we added a wealth management arm, and by last year we were managing $180 million in client assets across 340 households. I bought a condo outright in 2019 for $445,000. I kept the Cedar Hollow folder updated the entire time, even as Gregory and Renee kept living in that house rent-free, year after year. The buyout conversation always next spring. Contact from my family, across those 13 years, was thin and almost always transactional. In 2019, Gregory texted me, "Hope you're doing okay. Tyler's starting travel soccer, tight on cash, no pressure. Y send $1,200 anual." In 2023, my mother had a fall in the driveway at Cedar Hollow, and Gregory called me directly for the first time in 4 years, not to ask how I was, but to ask if I could help cover Tyler's $15,000 travel soccer academy fees while things were tight, reminding me that family helps family. I wired it within the week, still hoping, somewhere underneath the accounting, that this meant something was thawing. It wasn't. 3 months ago, Renee accidentally added me to a text thread meant for her sister and sister-in-law, planning what they'd do once Diane finally lets the house thing go. Renee had written, she's not going to fight for it forever. Once she does, we refinance and pull the equity for Tyler's academy and maybe a car for him at 16. I read it twice, sitting in my kitchen with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand, and I finally understood that the buyout conversation had never been a delay. It had been a strategy. I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Chun, the next morning. He confirmed what I'd suspected. As a tenant in common, Ohio law gave me the right to force a petition sale if my co-owner wouldn't buy me out or pay rent, and 13 years of documented, ignored good faith offers made my position airtight. I told him to proceed. I mailed Gregory's certified notice on April 2nd, giving him 90 days to buy out my half at current appraised value, $306,000, or the house would be listed and sold. Certified mail records show he signed for it on April 5th. He never called. The house sold on July 14th for $612,000 to a young couple relocating for a hospital residency. My half closed at $306,000. My open heart surgery, a mitral valve repair I'd known about since April, the same week I'd sent that certified letter, was scheduled for July 15th, the very next morning at Belmont General. I told Gregory and my mother about the surgery 3 weeks ahead of time. Gregory said he'd be there. Instead, on July 15th, while I was under anesthesia for 4 hours and 11 minutes, Gregory was 45 minutes away at a regional championship soccer tournament, watching Tyler's team lose in penalty kicks. He didn't call the hospital. He didn't text. Helen sat in that waiting room instead, the way she'd sat beside me through 2 decades of things my own family hadn't shown up for. 6 days later, still moving carefully with a healing sternum, I was in my living room when Gregory let himself in. I'd never changed the code he'd had for years, furious, having driven past Cedar Hollow and seen a moving truck and a sold sign that wasn't the sign I told them to expect eventually, just sooner than he'd planned for. How could you do this to family while you were literally in the hospital without even telling me, he said, pacing my living room, still in his tournament polo. I stayed sitting. 13 years of practice had taught me how. I told you on April 2nd, I said, and I reached for the accordion folder I'd left on my coffee table that morning, almost like I'd known. I laid the certified mail receipt on the table, his signature clearly on it, dated April 5th. Then the 90-day notice. Then the closing statement. You had 90 days to buy out my half or ask for more time. I would have given you more time, Gregory, if you'd asked. You didn't respond to any of it. Not the letter, not 2 follow-up calls from Marcus's office, not 1 message. He picked up the receipt, his hand not quite steady, and for a moment the anger fell off his face entirely. I watched real fear move through him, the specific fear of a man realizing his son's school district was gone. Where are we supposed to live? He said quietly, not really a question. That was the truest thing he'd said in years. I didn't inherit half a house, so I could spend 13 years financing someone else's certainty that I'd eventually give up. I said it plainly, not unkindly, and for a second I think he actually heard it. Then, Renee's name lit up his phone, and something in him closed back over, and he said the paperwork was probably designed to confuse people, that I'd always been better with numbers than with people, my mother's line, recycled like it was a family heirloom instead of a wound. I let him say it. I didn't need him to agree with me to know I was right. He left without apologizing, and I haven't heard from my mother since, though Helen tells me that's its own kind of information. What has happened since wasn't anything I did to them. Gregory and Renee are renting a 2-bedroom in Belmont now while they figure out next steps, a conversation the equity split should have made possible years ago if he'd ever picked up the phone. 2 weeks ago, I got a card in the mail, handwritten from Tyler, 13 years old, saying he was sorry about my surgery and that his dad gets weird about the house stuff, but he hoped I was healing okay. I wrote him back. That door, unlike the others, I'm leaving wide open. If this is hitting close to home, drop a comment, because I promise the people who call your boundaries cold are usually the ones counting on you never enforcing them. Here's what 13 years taught me in my own words. Love that only shows up once it needs something isn't love. It's an invoice with better manners, and you're allowed to stop extending credit to people who never intended to pay you back. I didn't sell the house out of spite. I sold it because I'd spent over a decade proving I'd wait, and waiting had simply become the price of being underestimated. If you've ever been the reliable one, the difficult one, the one who got called cold for simply expecting fairness, I see you, and your boundaries were never the problem. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today and tell me in the comments, would you have given him more time, or was 13 years already more than enough? I'll see you in the next one.